Welcome to PwC's What's Next in Cyber podcast series. I'm Joe Nocera, PwC's leader of the Cybersecurity and Privacy Innovation Institute. And in this podcast, we'll be gathering some real-time feedback from our subject matter specialists on their approach to cybersecurity amidst this COVID-19 pandemic. Joining me remotely from their homes are Joyce, our global and US cybersecurity and privacy leader, and James Shira, our Chief Information Technology Officer and CISO here at PwC. So welcome, Sean and James.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Joe. Good to be here.
All right, let's get started. I'd like to start out by having you both talk about kind of how we're dealing with this pandemic. Maybe, James, you could start by talking about what we're doing here at PwC and how we're responding. And then, Sean, you could add some context of what we're seeing with our clients.
Sure, Joe. Thanks. Happy to take that question, and welcome to our participants in this podcast. As you can see, I'm speaking to you from my home, and like many of you during this time, I'm having to adapt to different types of working. One of the things at PwC that we pride ourselves on is putting and placing emphasis on our people. And so that was our initial focus and response, of course, to the crisis, was to ensure the well-being of our people and help them activate different ways of working. In my role, leading technology as well as being our CISO, my focus going back several years is to employ strategies that help us work in unique and different ways. Part of one of those strategies that we started employing several years ago was to begin to leverage the internet, the networks we all use at home and in the airport when we used to travel and other places, as a part of the network that PwC uses to promote and execute its business. And so in doing that, we've been able to help through modernizing our technology to facilitate having over 200,000 of our PwC citizens all around the world working on any given business day. And we've also established other support mechanisms that I won't get into the details on to help us provide real-time support to people who are working from their homes. And Joe, before I pass it back to you, I just want to add, this hasn't been a perfect experience. We've learned through this process. One of the things we've learned is the complete reliance we have, almost excessive reliance we have on the capability of home networks that are clearly not managed by me or by PwC, but are rather the home networks in our employees and partners' homes. And we've had to adapt, frankly, to helping troubleshoot things remotely, to helping ensure that those networks are operating as effectively as they can. And in summary, we've actually learned and we've started implementing monitoring capabilities when different carriers that we rely on, especially in the Northeastern corridor or here where I'm speaking to you on the Western part of the country, have broader impacts to their service. And so, Joe, I'd use that to describe a bit about how we got here and where we are today.
Okay, thanks. Sean, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about what we're seeing with the clients?
Yeah, and I'd like to build on kind of James's point, because I think, Joe, you and I have benefited as users from what James has done, and I've seen that reflected with a lot of our clients. So really, those companies that actually invested in the infrastructure and architecture and invested in the cybersecurity, it's really paying off now. And they've really had that ability to transition quickly to this work from home environment. We're seeing a lot of companies, I think, be challenged with the effects on the workforce, both from a reduction point of view. Do they furlough? Do they do layoffs? And then also from a reduction in productivity. And I don't mean an intentional reduction in productivity, but just the fact that many of us have all these additional stressors, right? We're all fighting for use of the computer, whether we have enough equipment for everyone in the household, whether you're, learning virtually. So we're just seeing, I think, a lot of challenges in the workforce. The other thing I think that a lot of companies are trying to figure out is this balance between flexibility and security. So we're seeing a lot of companies basically allow a lot of exceptions. And I think there's a lesson there to make sure that we're actually noting those exceptions, making sure that process is formalized, and actually keeping a log of these exceptions as we kind of reintegrate and return to work. The other thing, and I think James hit on it too, and I think PwC has been a leader in this, but a lot of companies, I think you're seeing the ones that are doing well from a morale and workforce perspective, is really about taking care of your people. So I think that is the number one thing that any CISO or leader out there can be doing. And I see the companies that are doing this well, where the workforce is actually, the morale is improving, that they're recognizing that there are additional stresses out there, like I previously mentioned, and helping them with, psychological help, with able to balance, whether it's daycare or the workload, and really offering that flexibility. So I think we're seeing the companies that are quickly being able to adapt and are being agile. The second thing is, it's surprising, but on one of the surveys that we did with our COVID-19 Navigator, is 83% of companies acknowledge that they don't have formal processes in place to track employees. So that was a little bit of a surprise to me, because I know everyone typically from their crisis management plan has a way to do this. Typically, we think of that as a natural disaster event or something like that. But surprising. So, here's where I think we've been innovative and reflected some of the market's needs, coming out with what we're calling our check-in app or Status Connect, and then also with our activity tracing app. So it's some of these things I think that I'm seeing a lot of companies really desiring and really shifting from that phase to, how do we actually recover from this? How do we reintegrate the workforce?
That's great. So Sean, maybe talk a little bit about the threat landscape. We've heard a lot about the types of threats and enhanced threats that are happening during the pandemic. What are you seeing?
So it's a little bit of the same old, but in new places. So I would look at it from the perspective of, number one, we're seeing a resurgence in ransomware. This weekend, I was talking to a company that had experienced that affected many of his clients and customers, from business email compromise, especially in the work from home environment, where the cyber criminals are finding it easier to impersonate key executives, key personnel. So, I am advocating to all these companies, make sure you have those formal processes in place for large disbursements, whether it's to third-party vendors or partners or whatever that may be. And then the last one, and the largest one, is really the amount of phishing that is going on related to the current environment. So, it is amazing how many we're saying about, hey, your VPN needs an upgrade, please re-enter your credentials and passwords. And we're seeing, the credential stealing, a lot related to some of the funding packages that are out there, the CARES Act, the FEMA funding, and some of the other funding mechanisms. And then, anything related to what the ongoing crisis, whether it's cures, equipment, and things related in that nature.
James, what have we seen internally, or not internally as much, I guess, targeting PwC as a firm?
Yeah, and I just want to build on some of the comments that Sean made, and I'm going to talk a little bit to CISOs that are maybe participating and understand some of these challenges in their organizations. We started, just to set up, we started our cyber journey at PwC really in earnest some years past. And when we took that step forward, we looked at our architecture and we examined our architecture for the areas where we felt we had the most improvement opportunity, but also where we anticipated our business would need greater resiliency and reliability. One of them, of course, was remote access, which Sean mentioned. But also, in addition to that, was our email and messaging management systems. And we have fortunately completed those efforts in the recent past and modernized our email gateways. We're implementing email fraud defense, for example, which I know is a very complicated project. But if listeners would like our help with that, we can obviously engage and provide examples and support. Those initiatives have allowed us to deal with the uptick in efforts that Sean mentioned that we are seeing. We consistently have people who attempt to impersonate senior leaders in our organization. We consistently have efforts via phishing and others to try and prompt financial transactions like Sean alluded to that happen in the broader industry. And we've seen an increase in these, unfortunately, as a consequence of the current crisis we're going through. It's not terribly surprising insofar as we know that when large events occur, like be it elections or things like this, we know that criminals are going to activate strategies to attempt to take advantage of these. I think what has been somewhat different in this case has been the volume. And we've seen a noticeable increase in the volume of the attempts. And I think others listening are no doubt probably experiencing the same thing.
Just to add on to that, James makes a great point. And there was one comment that someone said, I've never seen so many phishing campaigns in so many different languages. So I thought that was kind of an interesting comment, reflecting the pandemic and how it's affecting almost every country throughout the world. The other thing, Joe, I want to mention is we're also starting to see an uptick in some nation state activities. So I want folks to remember that. And then the second thing is a lot of, I mentioned the ransomware, business email compromise, and phishing, but really looking at the fraud that is happening out there. James mentioned that, but really seeing that at, I think, proportions that we haven't seen previously, really specifically on this event.
Great, that's helpful. Sean, maybe talk a little bit about the evolution of this crisis. How are organizations kind of moving on from some of the initial phases of the pandemic to where we're at today and where they may be a few weeks or months from now?
So I think we've seen some different things, but when I look at this, I really look at it as three phases that are running concurrently, not consecutively, concurrently. So when I say the three phases of mobilize, stabilize, and strategize, and those things are happening, right? First, on the mobilize, everyone, all of it really had to adjust very quickly to how do I adjust to this new environment where my workforce is basically at home? How do I deal with that? Right? That was the first phase, but very quickly and at the same time, they were talking about how do I stabilize my business? How do I make sure that we're doing the critical functions that we need to do? And then I think in parallel, they're looking at ways of how do I actually pivot my business? How do I actually change my business to this new environment? And I think what we've seen is some companies really quickening the pace that they're doing a digital transformation. I think you see that specifically in the healthcare industry when you're talking about telehealth. That was really in its nascent stages. And I believe after this, it's going to be mainstream. I think you're seeing a lot of the late digital adopters that didn't do a lot of their work, right, or shopping online or banking online, that they have now fully adopted and they're not going to go back. So I think we're really seeing this quick evolution that's happening. I think you're seeing companies that were traditionally B2B moving B2C directly to their customers to make sure they have that really efficient connection and direct connection with the consumer. And then really that leveraging the cloud, right? That's going to give you that agility and adaptability. We've been talking about movement to the cloud for the last 5 years. This, I really think, is going to force companies that know they have to make that digital transformation to really be and quickly adopt the cloud. So, I think we're seeing a lot of things. And then the last big thing we're going to see that's going to be a permanent change is regarding the workforce. I think you're going to see a lot of folks that are not going to actually go back to work. You're going to see a lot of companies and business units and specific departments realize that these people can stay remote. So I really do think we're seeing some big changes that are going to have some big effects in the market.
Okay. Well, maybe our final question, keeping with the title of the podcast, what is next for CISOs? What should CISOs be planning for next?
I think a lot of CISOs are arriving at this crisis probably reasonably well prepared, given the fact that security in many organizations has been a hot topic for investment for several years. One of the things that I think is really important for CISOs in terms of a next step, and I'm stating the obvious here, but I think it bears mentioning, you've got to look for the places in your business right now that are evolving, like Sean was talking about, or will need to be evolved. And I would strongly encourage strongly marrying your security strategy with the necessary business evolution, which sounds like an obvious thing to say, but in practice is not commonly done, or in my opinion, commonly done enough. So an example would be looking at things like zero trust and other security strategies, and then providing for your leadership an overlay that helps explain how these actually facilitate the different way we're going to work and the different ways we're going to operate. Secondly, I would say you've got to really anticipate, and it builds on my comment on zero trust, that devices, even more so, will not be necessarily corporate owned. Networks will not necessarily be directly corporate managed. And therefore, we've got to focus on security strategies that take those into account. However, even with all that in mind, we know that it takes several core components consistently in breaches to allow a breach to occur. You've got to have privilege. You've got to have a foothold in an environment, and or potentially a 0-day or some exploitable opportunity. And therefore, your program also obviously has to incorporate consideration of these. And I'll summarize by saying, Joe, that I believe this is a great moment for CISOs as leaders to really help security be the enablement function that it really can and should be. And rather than, like in the old days, dating myself, where it might have been, years past, more of an inhibitor to business strategy. And I think now a great cyber strategy is actually very much about enabling the CEO and his team or her team to go off and activate the broader business changes that this crisis and the climate we're in require.
So Joe, I'd like to add to that. I think James raises some great points, and really kind of how you're linking what the CISO is doing to the business strategy. And I think the CISOs that are really going to do well in the next year are the ones that are going to be innovative when it comes to, I think, the workforce issues that I previously mentioned. So how are they actually adopting new controls to a work from home environment, right? How are they adopting sort of the reintegration of their workforce and determining what actually can stay remote versus, what needs to be on site? And then really looking at, I think everyone will be looking at some cost efficiencies. So really looking at, the tools they have and understanding the breadth of what those tools can provide and making sure they're properly configured, I think is going to be critical in the months to come.
Okay, well, I think it's time for us to wrap up. I'd like to thank both James and Sean for joining us today. I think it was a great discussion. And also thanks to those listening. We're going to be back hopefully soon with another episode of What's Next in Cyber.